Hello, and thank you so much for joining me for this video. My name is Dr. Doe Buchli, and I have been a professor in the psychology department of Mercer University for 8 years. And in this video, I am going to talk about a phenomenon in psychology known as suppression-induced forgetting. So if you are watching this video, you have made the wonderful decision to join my memory lab as a research assistant. So this is one area that relates to my research, and therefore I want you to be somewhat knowledgeable about it. So imagine yourself in a situation that might be kind of embarrassing or maybe emotionally distressing, right? So maybe you break up with a significant other, or maybe you're in a social situation where you make a joke that isn't perceived as funny, or some other socially awkward encounter, right? Well, it's likely that if you are continually confronted with reminders of that event, right, that's going to disrupt your psychological functioning, right? So in psychology, we utilize a term known as emotional regulation. So emotional regulation just means having control over the emotions that one experiences, particularly the more upsetting emotions, such as shame, sadness, things like that, right? So from a psychological perspective, right, it might be advantageous to focus on memories for positive experiences, right? And maybe discount some of those negative experiences, right? Well, it turns out that the research suggests that with surprising consistency, people across the world of all ages, ethnicities, and income levels report being generally happy with their lives, right? And this feeling of general well-being is widespread and often occurs regardless of individual circumstances. So, for example, people with physical or mental disabilities, people with low incomes, and people in who are members of minority groups, right, that often face discrimination and other challenges, right, still report when asked to reflect on their lives, generally high levels of happiness, right? And one of the possible mechanisms that allows for this is something known as a positivity bias in what people remember over the long term. So, for example, in 1948, there was an experiment conducted where participants were given 85 minutes to generate as many memories as they could recall for the first 8 years of their lives. Okay? And of these possible memories from the first 8 years of their lives, people rated about half as pleasant, 30% as unpleasant, and 20% as neutral. So globally, what this suggests is that for whatever reason, positive memories were simply more accessible, or they came to mind more easily, right? So what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that memory may contribute to this feeling of overall happiness or perceived well-being, right? So our assessment of how we are doing in many cases often relates to what we can remember. Okay, another example. A similar finding occurs when instead of asking people to generate memories intentionally, you ask them to report about the memories that sort of spontaneously pop into their head over time. Okay, so when people were asked to report of these involuntary memories that popped into their head, 49% were pleasant, 32% were neutral, and just 19% were unpleasant, right? So whether we're talking about memories that people intentionally retrieve or memories that just spontaneously get recalled, we seem to be better at recollecting positive memories rather than negative memories, right? Or maybe more accurately, We seem to be more apt at recalling either positive or neutral memories at the expense of negative memories, right? So, what that suggests is there seems to be a pre-wired, right? And one might even say biological propensity in our cognitive architecture to favor positive memories, right? And recall positive memories as opposed to negative memories. In an even more striking demonstration of this tendency, Susan Charles, Martha Mather, and Lauren Carstensen conducted a simple study suggesting that our memory biases are no accident. So they asked younger and older adults to view 32 scenes, and these scenes included a mixture of pleasant, neutral, and unpleasant images. So after a 15-minute delay, participants recalled as many of the pictures as they could, right? And pictures, generally speaking, pictures with emotional content were remembered better in general than were neutral pictures that didn't contain emotional content. And older adults recalled fewer pictures than did younger adults. Right? So we know, right, from the outset, it has been well established that emotional valence, or anything that has an emotional property associated with it, is going to be better committed to memory than things that are neutral. And we know that generally speaking, younger adults have better memories in a variety of different, with a variety of different materials and a variety of different types of memory tests, right? So those results in and of itself aren't particularly striking, but this is what was striking. So importantly, as participants got older, their memories became progressively more biased in favor of the positive scenes over the negative ones. Even though all scenes were viewed for the same amount of time, younger participants recalled both positive and negative scenes with equal frequency, whereas older adults recalled nearly twice as many positive than negative scenes, right? And subsequently, it was revealed that older adults could recognize both the positive and negative scenes equally well, right? Which suggests they have the same storage access as younger adults. But when they tried to volitionally retrieve that information from long-term memory, they favored the positive ones, right? So what that suggests more broadly is that although memory overall tends to decline with age, older adults tend to remember fewer negative memories relative to positive ones, demonstrating an age-related positivity bias, right? And so just like it behooves us in terms of our emotional regulation and psychological functioning to favor recalling positive experiences, such as maybe the successes that we've shared, and the relationships that we have that have been successful, right? At the expense of maybe those upsetting breakups and embarrassing scenarios, right? So just like it benefits us to focus on the positive, whereas the negative, at the expense of the negative at any age, as we age or as we get older and we're thinking more deliberately about the things that we've accomplished in our lives, right? It benefits us to spend more time thinking about positive things than negative ones, right? So what that suggests is really that memory is goal directed, or there's a lot of volitional processes that direct our memories. And in particular, we're motivated to protect psychological functioning and to preserve our sort of healthy sense of identity, as we see with the positivity bias. So you might have noticed that the title of this slide is Suppression Induced Forgetting. And so when you think about the word suppression, that might remind you of a similar word known as repression. So, repression is a psychological concept that's most predominantly associated with Sigmund Freud and his psychosexual theory of development, right? So, repression, according to Freud's framework, refers to a psychological defense mechanism that banishes unwanted memories, ideas, and feelings into the unconscious to reduce conflict and psychological pain, right? So Freud distinguishes between the unconscious level, the preconscious level, and the conscious level using this kind of iceberg diagram, right? So, according to Freud, at the unconscious level, we have basic impulses, um, typically impulses regarding sex and aggression that seek immediate gratification, and they're often irrational and impulsive, okay? As opposed to the pre-conscious level where we focus on or where we incorporate the rules that are governed by society, okay, and attempt to behave in a way that upholds those standards, right? So the superego is involved with um, ideals and morals as dictated by society, okay? And they're often incorporated by the parents and things of that nature. And then we have the conscious level, which is the ego, when the ego attempts to sort of to reconcile the id and the superego, right? So all of those things should be relatively familiar to you if you've taken introductory psychology or personality psychology, right? But all of Freud's theories regarding repression have been thoroughly discredited, right? So his notion of repression and defense mechanisms actually doesn't have any sort of supporting evidence by today's standards, right? But for our purposes, we want to distinguish this Freudian concept of repression from the more contemporary and better supported notion of suppression, right? So Freud used repression in a number of ways, but essentially his definition of repression was as follows. The essence of repression lies simply in the function of rejecting and keeping something out of consciousness. Okay? So keep that in mind. Now let's look, right, at the distinction between repression versus suppression, right? So within Freud's framework, repressed contents were not necessarily eliminated from the mind, but rather they were simply excluded from conscious awareness, right? So they could still influence behavior below the level of awareness. So, for example, they could manifest in dreams, in preferences, in choice of topics to discuss, or in emotional reactions, right? So, even though the person isn't consciously aware of the fact that they have repressed these things or kept them below the level of consciousness, right? They still exert an influence on behavior. Okay. And in addition to that, the contents of what were repressed were not guaranteed to remain unconscious, okay? But they could pop up again later, and this was a phenomenon that Freud termed return of the repressed, okay? So let's contrast that with the idea of suppression, right? So repression refers to a phenomenon whereby unwanted impulses or thoughts are being unconsciously pushed out of awareness, right? So unconscious implies a lack of volition or a lack of intent, right? So unconscious means this happens automatically outside of the person's awareness, right? Suppression is a form of motivated or goal-directed forgetting, right? So this is a volitional process under the exact control of the person doing the remembering, right? So when we talk about thought suppression, what we're talking about is deliberately trying to forget or not think about painful or unwanted thoughts, right? So suppression, right, is when you are confronted with a reminder of a breakup with a former significant other, right? So maybe you're cleaning out your closet in your dorm room and you come across an old a gift from that person, maybe a little trinket or something that they bought you, right? So you see it and suddenly you're flooded with all of these memories of that individual and the associated emotions, right? So maybe you see that object and you're suddenly overcome with sadness and despair at the fact that that person is no longer there, right? So maybe you get rid of the object the first time that happens, right? But maybe another object kind of reminds you of that same experience. And so instead of trying to remove the object, right, you might engage in thought suppression. So you might deliberately say, oh, I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about that. So I'm going to consciously try to suppress those thoughts and prevent them from entering into awareness, right? That's suppression versus repression. Repression is an unconscious or automatic process outside of the awareness of an individual, whereas suppression is a conscious, deliberate, volitional process whereby we try to control the contents of our memories by allowing ourselves to think of certain things, predominantly positive memories, right? While also at the same time actively trying to prevent the conscious recollection of things that are distressing, right? So how might something like this work, right? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of literature, not so much on the suppression of thoughts, but rather on the suppression of responses. And a lot of times by responses we mean actions or motor responses, right? So kind of in the classic example of what's been termed response override, right? We suppress one response in favor of a less common but more appropriate response, right? So the classic example given by Michael Anderson is the following example. So imagine washing dishes at your sink and kind of, moving your hands around a little bit wildly as you move the soap from dish to dish to dish, right? And then all of a sudden, inadvertently, haphazardly, just by happenstance, you knock a plant from the windowsill, right? So what is the dominant response in this scenario? The dominant response is to try to catch the plant before it falls and breaks, right? So that's the dominant response. But what about a situation where that plant is a cactus, right? Then it becomes imperative to suppress or prevent that response in favor of a less common but much more appropriate response of letting the plant fall, right? So obviously we don't want to catch a cactus in our hands because all those tiny little needles would embed into our skin and be very painful, right? So response override is actively suppressing that more common response in favor of a less common one, right? And so the neural mechanisms and mechanisms within our cognitive architecture for response override are in fact very, very similar to those we adopt for thought suppression. Okay, so the paradigm that Anderson and colleagues adopted to study this idea of suppression-induced forgetting or thought suppression is a paradigm known as the think-no-think paradigm. And this is the paradigm that we also use in my laboratory when we're attempting to answer questions about thought suppression. So essentially, if you were a participant in this experiment, things would proceed in a series of phases, right? So the first phase is I would present to you a series of unrelated word pairs, right? So for example, you might see ordeal, roach. You might see um, steam, train. You might see rent, week. Okay? So your first task would simply be to study these word pairs until you reach a particular point where you can reliably recall the second word given the first word as a cue, right? So if I give you the word ordeal, you can supply the next word, which is roach. Okay? And the notion with this first phase is that we want to make sure that the first word becomes a very, very reliable or predictable reminder of the second word. Okay? And then in the second phase of the experiment, okay, for most of the words, you're going to be given the first word as a cue, okay? And your response is going to be to think of the second word, right? So for example, if you were to see the word steam in green, you would know that your task is to think of the second word, which is train, right? And by far, most of the trials in the second phase are going to be think trials, right? So the think trials are those in green, where you're given the reminder in the form of the first word, and you have to think of the second word, right? But on some of those trials, right, you're going to see the first word in red. And so for those red trials or no think trials, your instruction is going to be to do anything within your power not to think of the second word, right? So that's why this is known as the think, no think paradigm, right? And it's meant to be a laboratory analog to that real world experience of being confronted with a reminder of something traumatic or distressing, or maybe even just something embarrassing that you would rather not think about, right? Um, and trying to do kind of a thought override, right? Where you deliberately, as a goal directed volitional process, try to keep that thought out of your awareness, right? Again, for the express purpose of preserving your psychological functioning, right? To prevent feelings of embarrassment or sadness or distress, okay? And so then, in a subsequent phase, in the last phase, we test people's memory for those items, right? And so this is really where the magic of cognitive psychology comes in, guys. Because obviously, we can't directly observe consciousness, right? The mind is a black box. It's inherently unobservable, right? So we don't really know in real time whether people are suppressing the thought on the red trials or thinking of the item on the green trials, right? But we can infer based on the consequences of what happens during that think, no think phase, right? And the consequences are twofold, okay? One consequence of that think, no think phase is that the think items or the words in green are better recalled than baseline items, right? So just like with retrieval induced forgetting, right, in the other video that you watched, we have some items that are not featured during that think, no think phase, right? So we have some items that participants studied, but they weren't exposed to again in that middle phase, and that's our baseline, right? So relative to baseline items, people's memory for think items is improved, which makes sense, right? Thinking about an item or retrieving that item, right, is going to improve its accessibility later on, right? But we also see a really, really interesting phenomenon known as suppression-induced forgetting, whereby the items on those red trials or those no-think trials are recalled less well compared to items that were studied but not part of that second think no think phase. Okay, so what we can infer based on the mnemonic or memory related consequences of the think no think instruction is that people actually are keeping those items out of awareness, right? So you might tell yourself, right? Maybe what's happening is people are simply thinking of another word, right? So maybe people are just trying to distract themselves by coming up with another item to associate with the cue besides the one that they initially studied, right? And that would make sense, right? So what that suggests might be happening is simply a weakened association between, for example, ordeal, roach. But interestingly, we find the same consequences whether participants are given the cue they studied with, which is ordeal, or if they're given a totally novel cue, such as insect. So it's not so much that people are thinking of a new item, right? And therefore disrupting the association between the word pair, but rather they are suppressing their memory for the item itself. So what other evidence do we have that people are actively suppressing the no-think items in the think-no-think paradigm, right? Or what other evidence do we have that this phenomenon of suppression-induced forgetting exists? Well, when researchers put participants in an fMRI scanner while they complete this think, no think task, what they see based on these scans, right, the neuroimaging results, is that the lateral prefrontal cortex, which you see there in green, is recruited exclusively during the no think trials, okay? So this area of the brain is not activated during the think trials, only during the no think trials. And what the lateral prefrontal cortex does is it specifically suppresses neural activity in the hippocampus, thereby preventing unwanted memories from coming to mind. So not only do we have the behavioral result that the items that people are expressly told not to think about during that critical phase are remembered less well compared to baseline items, right? We also have converging evidence in the form of neuroimaging data, right? Um, Demonstrating that the area of the brain that's responsible for control of not only selective remembering, but also response override, just like I showed you in the cactus example, is being recruited, right, to suppress hippocampal activity and prevent these memories from being activated. Right? So again, we see converging evidence with both behavioral research and also neuroscientific research. Right? So you might ask yourself, what sort of questions are we going to be investigating with respect to suppression-induced forgetting? Well, a lot of our research is simply going to focus on replicating this result under a number of different conditions to see how well it generalizes, right? And there's already been a number of papers, including meta-analyses, that suggest that suppression-induced forgetting is a very robust and reliable phenomenon, right? We're also going to look at strategies that seem to increase the likelihood of suppression-induced forgetting, or individual differences that make people more apt at suppression-induced forgetting. So for example, people that continuously engage in the practice of mindfulness, right? We would expect them to be more proficient at preventing distressing or unsettling things from coming to mind, because that's sort of the goal of mindfulness, right? Is to kind of exert control over your thoughts and impulses, right? So yeah, so generally what we do in my lab is we try to replicate the suppression-induced forgetting result under a number of different conditions, and we also look at what properties or individual differences, such as mindfulness training, for example, might make one more likely to demonstrate this suppression-induced forgetting effect. All right, thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to talking to you soon.